but Robert turned full around at the tennis courts. "Dad," he said, "if we got home early enough, will you hit with me?" I could hear the effort it took for my father to make his voice gentle. "We won't get home early enough." Robert said, "But if we do?" "If we do," my father said, "I would be delighted to play with you." Robert was just going into 5th grade and would probably be the smallest boy in his class again, but he was almost as good a tennis player as my father. Robert ran for every shot, no matter how hopelessly high or unhittably hard. He was as consistent as a backboard. At the courts, he'd play with anyone who asked, the lacquered ladies who needed a fourth, the stubby surgeon who kept a lit cigarette gritted between his teeth, the little girl who got distracted by butterflies. On the Garden State Parkway, nobody spoke. My parents were miserable, probably because they'd agreed not to smoke in the car. Robert was miserable because they were, though he was the reason they weren't smoking. He was always begging them to quit, and they half pretended they had. I was miserable because we were rushing toward the boredom only a bat mitzvah could bring. Jack seemed oblivious. He was looking out the window. Maybe he was imagining himself away at college, which he and my father talked about nonstop. Whenever I reminded Jack that it was a whole year away, he'd say how fast it would go. I'd say, "How do you know?" A question apparently undeserving of a reply. Rebecca, whose bat mitzvah we were going to celebrate, was hardly even related to me. Our mothers were distant cousins who'd learned to walk on the same street of row houses in West Philadelphia, and then when their families had moved to the suburbs, the cousins had gone to the same private school, camp, and college. I'd seen pictures of them as babies in sunbonnets in Atlantic City, as girls in plaid shorts in the Adirondacks, as young women in sunglasses in Paris. Both were petite, both had dark hair, and my mother said that both had gotten too thin during their phase of Jackie Onassis worship. In my opinion, Aunt Nora was still too thin, and Rebecca was even thinner. She was a ballerina and kept her shoulders back too far and her head up too high. She would sometimes swoop into ballet jumps out of nowhere, when the four of us were trying to find the car in a parking lot, for example. That winter, she'd been the understudy for Clara in the Nutcracker Suite in New York City, and my mother had insisted we go. I said, "In case the real Clara breaks her leg?" "We're going because it'll be fun," she said. "It's an enormous honor for Rebecca to be in the ballet." "She's not in it," I said. During the ballet, I tried to be open-minded, but it made no sense to me. It seemed as likely for a girl to dance with a nutcracker as with a corkscrew or an egg beater. During lunch, when Aunt Nora asked how I'd liked the performance, I said, "It wasn't my cup of tea," a phrase my mother had instructed me to use in place of yuck, but which now seemed to affect Aunt Nora as my yucks had my mother. Flustered, I told Rebecca that I was sure the ballet would have been better if she'd been in it, and added a sympathetic, "I'm sorry you weren't picked." I didn't realize my mistake until Rebecca scowled. Aunt Nora gave my mother a look, which was the same as talking about me while I was there. On the train back to Philadelphia, my mother pretended that the four of us had enjoyed a splendid afternoon. She admired how thin and delicate Rebecca was. "Like a long stem rose," she said. I said, "She's more like a long piece of hair with hair." I expected my mother to be angry, but instead she seemed almost glad, not that she said so. What she said was, "You might become friends when you're older." I said, "I don't think so." "Why not, Puss?" I shrugged. I told her that Rebecca had turned down a piece of gum I'd offered by saying, "I don't chew gum. It's not ladylike." My mother saw nothing wrong with this. It was something she herself might have said, which was what was wrong with it. She repeated a ditty from her early life with Aunt Nora. "We don't smoke, and we don't chew, and we don't go with the boys who do." My mother told the same stories over and over, maybe 25 in all. If you added them up, there were only about 2 hours of her life that she wanted me to know about. At a rest stop on the New Jersey Turnpike, we stretched our legs until my mother returned from the ladies' room. When she did, Robert said, "You look great, Mom." She did look great. The day before, she'd driven herself to Philadelphia to have her hair professionally colored, a wise decision, as her hair had turned orangey in the sun. Back in the car, my father said he liked her dress, a mod print in yellow and pink. I said, "It's a designer dress," which was what my mother had told me. Now that the trouble seemed to have passed and the air conditioning was on, I considered asking Robert to trade places with me. My father, who could be what my mother called a reverse snob, said that all dresses were designer dresses. Someone had designed them. "Not Poochie," my mother said in a haughty voice. "Ah," my father said, putting on the dog, which was supposed to be a joke, but she didn't laugh. I stayed where I was. I patted Albert's fleecy black coat. Looking into his sad eyes, I said, "I know just how you feel." We were on the exit ramp for Chappaqua when my mother turned around and smiled in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. It was her way of saying smile, without risking the opposite, at least for me. Before we walked into the synagogue, she said, "I'm so proud of all of you," like she was making a commercial about our family. This synagogue was about twice as big as the one we went to, and the service seemed 10 times as long, as it was almost entirely in Hebrew, a language I did not speak. Finally, Rebecca went to the podium, her toes pointed out. She seemed glad to be up there, in her chiffony pink dress, white tights, and black Mary Janes. She wore her hair back in a looped braid tied with a pink satin ribbon, though she might as well have been wearing a halo for the way my mother gazed up at her. For a second, Rebecca looked out at the audience, at her family, and her friends, and her family's friends, and all of the religious fanatics who had chosen to spend the most beautiful day of the entire summer inside. It occurred to me that she saw us as her public, and maybe she wished she could dance the part of Clara that she'd worked so hard to learn. Then she looked down at the Torah the rabbi had ceremoniously undressed and unscrolled, and she began to read aloud. I kept thinking she would have to stop soon, but I was wrong about that. She seemed to be reading the entire Torah up there. Maybe she'd learned how to pronounce the Hebrew words, but you could tell she had no idea what they meant. She read with zero expression, as though reciting the Hebrew translation of a phone book or soup label, the only semblance of an intonation a pause at the end of a listing or ingredient. In contrast, my mother, who was no more fluent in Hebrew than I, appeared utterly enthralled. She even nodded occasionally, as though finding this or that passage especially insightful and moving. Hebrew comprehension wasn't the only thing my mother was faking. When I pulled her wrist over to look at her watch and made a face that signified, "I'm dying," she posed her mouth in a smile. Then she held my hand, as though we were in love. I couldn't see my father, but I thought he probably liked how long the service was. He'd become more religious since his own father had died. Before, my father had only gone to services on the major holidays with us, but now he sometimes went on Friday nights, too. He walked as the Orthodox did, even though he was heading toward our Reform synagogue, the least religious one possible. Usually my mother went with him, but one night he'd gone alone. I'd watched him from my window, and it was strange to see him walking down our suburban street by himself. I was so relieved when the service was over that I let my mother kiss me. Then it was time to go downstairs to what was called a luncheon instead of lunch. The catering hall was decorated with pink drapes, pink carpeting, and pink tablecloths. A pink tutu encircled each centerpiece of pink roses. Even the air seemed pink. My mother found the pink place card with my name and table number. She announced that I was sitting with Rebecca,